So I think so. Yes, I'm on. So a few things about myself and then a couple of caveats, and then we'll dive into the conversation. As mentioned, I'm the relatively new senior rabbi of Temple Israel. Before that, I was rabbi in the Reformed Temple of Rockland in Rockland County in the New York area for 7 years. Before that, I was at Harsanah Congregation in Baltimore, Maryland for 6 years, and before that, the assistant and associate rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Tucson, Arizona. I often get the question, what's the difference between assistant and associate? I don't know, but I do know they start with the same 3 letters. So, today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. I was told I can pick whatever I want to talk about. And I want to sort of dive into the question of why, in particular, are evangelicals so interested in Judaism, interested in Jews, and interested in Israel. And so that's sort of what we're going to be diving into. A little bit about myself. I love to over-prepare, so we are not going to get through everything in the packet, and we're not going to get through everything that I prepared today. The caveat is this is an area I have studied. I do not profess to be an expert in all the material I'm presenting. So if you hear something that contradicts anything I say, they're right, I'm wrong, that's okay. Also, I welcome questions. I do ask you raise your hand, and if I don't get to you right away, it's just so I can finish my thought before it gets derailed. But I do welcome any and all questions of clarification, curiosity. The goal is to keep them relatively brief so that way I'm able to answer them to the best of my ability. And I promise to answer half of your questions, and of those I promise to answer half of them correctly. So you've got a 25% odd that it's in your favor. So what are we talking about today? Well, we are in a time where there are very interesting relations between evangelicals and Jews and Israel. And so we're going to look a little bit about the history, very briefly, about the rise of Christianity and how it relates to Judaism. And the reason why we're doing that is because it really lays the foundation for why they tend to be, for lack of a better phrase, so obsessed with us. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history, and then, if we are able to get to it, sort of the modern terms that are going on in the world, including millennialism, the rapture, and tribulation. If we don't get to it all, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I can come back and add into this conversation later on. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk very briefly about a few terms that I use whenever I teach about Judaism. And my apologies if you're familiar with these, I just want to make sure we're on the same level. First of all, I tend to use the term Tanakh for the Hebrew Bible. I do not use the term Old Testament because that is a theological term. Old means it's been supplanted by something new. So the Old Testament, the New, I don't. So if you're thinking Old Testament, just think Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible. Also, I don't use the terms BC and AD. BC means before Christ, and AD means, anybody know? Which means? The year of the Lord. So I don't use those because, again, those are theological terms. So I use BCE and CE before the Common Era and the Common Era. And the reason for that is because when it comes to calendration, you got to pick a point in time to start everything, so that way we can relate to history. The Hebrew calendar goes all the way back, because somebody did the math, to what they believe was the first day of creation, which is why ours just keeps going up, as opposed to BCE, where it goes down, gets the year 1, skips the year 0, and then goes up again. So that's just a couple of points in terminology. So the first thing I give you guys in your packets is what I call a very brief history of Judaism. This is actually not even the entire timeline I put together, but I give that to you just so you have a general reference point. Now, a couple of points about it. Up until the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, about 1213 to 1203, we don't have any archaeological evidence of the Israelites. So when it comes to Abraham, we know there were people like him that were these warrior chieftains, and it's quite possible that Abraham existed amongst that, but because they were nomadic peoples, we don't have any archaeological evidence, which isn't to say he didn't exist, just to say we don't have extra biblical proof, meaning proof out of the Bible. The first piece of extra biblical proof comes to us from Pharaoh Merneptah, and it's a stele. And what happened with pharaohs is wherever they went and engaged in battle, they always won. Because they had great publicists, they never lost. So amongst the peoples it defeated on the stele are a group of peoples known as the Israelites. So we know, at least going back to the year 1200 before the Common Era, there is extra biblical proof of the Israelites living in the land. You can put that away in your pocket for other conversations we're not engaging to today. For our purposes, we're going to skip ahead. We are going to skip ahead. You can actually go past the first page, and you're going to go to the second page where it says 333 before the Common Era. That is one of the most critical moments in Western history. And the reason why it's critical is that was the arrival of Alexander the Great, who came in, conquered the land, and then died in 332. Nonetheless, he brought with him Hellenism. And the combination of Judaism and Hellenism cannot be understated. What happened with the arrival of Hellenism? Well, Greek language became very common in the land of Israel. They brought with it thought and culture and arts. You see the rise of Greek cities like Gaza, Yaffo, and later Caesarea or Caesarea. You see them influencing state and laws and public affairs, eventually denationalizing the Jewish states, and the rise of Greek polytheism in the land. Now, I mention all of this because it's not like this outside influence came in and all Jews rejected it. What happened is there were groups of Jews who welcomed Hellenism and embraced it, especially among the upper classes. And so they got involved and they started to speak Greek and dress like Greeks and talk like Greeks and embrace Greek thought and the Greek world. And one of the first things that happened following the arrival of Hellenism is the Torah, which was canonized. Canon means it becomes a closed corpus in about 450 before the Common Era, is it was translated somewhere between 300 and 200 into Greek, known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint became the source text for almost every translation of the Bible to this very day. And so there's the story, of the 70 Jewish scholars, that each one of them had to translate it into Greek, and if there was any differences, they would all be killed. That didn't happen. It's a wonderful Baba Miza, but it does emphasize the notion that this Greek translation of the Torah especially is very significant. Now, a note about translation. All translation involves interpretation. There is no direct way to translate any text from one language to another without the interpretation skills of the person doing the translation. Very, very important to note. Now, for the most part, most of those interpretive things are not of significance, but every now and then you'll get like a word, like say, for example, Alma. Anybody know what Alma means? Alma means young woman. Now, do young women give birth? Do they get pregnant and give birth? Yes, all the time. But what happens if you translate Alma not to mean young woman, but to mean virgin? Do virgins give birth? Well, to the best of our knowledge, no. But it does create a very interesting theological statement when you're translating the writings of Isaiah and you mistranslate a word, it can actually have profound implications. Now, as I mentioned, most of Christendom, which we'll get to shortly, relied heavily on the Septuagint. For example, the King James Bible, which many of you are familiar with, is an English translation of the Christian Bible for the Church of England, which was begun in 1604 and completed in 1611. So it was based off the Latin Vulgate, which was based off the Septuagint, which was based off the Tanakh. So the King James Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. You guys are familiar with lost in translation? So, and as I mentioned, many of these involve interpretation, so they do have significant impact, which is why, when in doubt, always go back to the original text. So, getting back to Hellenism and Judaism. So, in the Bible, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, there are conflicting ideas about the afterlife, what happens when you die. And you can see a little bit of this on what it says is page 5 in your packet, Biblical Concepts of the Afterlife. So we see, for example, references to Sheol. Sheol is kind of the underworld that you go when you die. Is it a good place? We don't know. Is it a bad place? We don't know. How long are you there? We don't know, we don't know, we don't know. The reality is the Bible, the Tanakh, is not really all that interested in what happens to you when you die. This is why I like to argue, in part, that Judaism is a very pragmatic tradition. We ask the questions, but we don't really spend a lot of time worrying about it because we're focused on the here and now. And part of that is because in our own tradition, there's not a lot of notion of what happens when you die, but there is certainly, at the time of the Tanakh, no notion of resurrection. So you go and you die, and what happens to you, Zygazint, we're not entirely sure. Now, older Hebrew conception of life regarded the nation of Israel as an entire unit. So no individual mortality or immortality was considered. What is it about? It's about preserving the life of Israel, not about the individual. And again, we see this reflective, especially in the Torah, but not exclusively. Why all these laws against breaking the mitzvot? Because you could bring down punishment on the nation. So it's about protecting the nation, and you are a part of the nation's journey while you are alive, and then you die, and you are no longer a part of the nation's journey. But the idea is to pass it on to the next generation. Everybody with me? Yeah. Okay. So, where does resurrection come from? Well, it's hinted at in Job 14:12, as you see at the bottom. So man lies down never to rise. He will wake only when the heavens are no more. Only then be aroused from his sleep. So it's hinted at, but there is no major theological statement about resurrection anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Well, where do we find it? Well, we find it starting to arise in books like the book of Enoch, in the book of Jubilees, and in the Wisdom of Solomon. The idea is the notion of resurrection starts to develop in conjunction with the arrival of Hellenism. That being said, there is no concept of a personal resurrection. It's about the resurrection of the nation, sort of like Elijah's vision of the dead bones rising. He was speaking metaphorically, but he's talking about the restoration of Israel. So the idea of resurrection of the dead starts to appear with Hellenism, but it's only sort of an ephemeral concept. Secondly, we have the rise of the idea of the Mashiach, the Messiah. If you read through the prophets, you'll see them talk about a Mashiach. The Messiah, the anointed one, by the way, it means anointed, and Christ means anointed. That wasn't Jesus' last name. Christ means anointed or Messiah or Mashiach. When prophets like Isaiah are talking about the Mashiach, the Messiah, they are talking about a particular person at a particular point in time who's going to save Israel from something. So it's not someone who's going to come and save all of humanity. So for example, one of the people they were probably referencing was Hezekiah, who saved Judea from the Assyrians. He, by the way, should be in the pantheon of the great kings of Israel with David and Solomon. Hezekiah should be right up there as well. So we have the planting of the seeds of the resurrection, but not of a person, and an anointed one who will save Israel. And we're going to talk about why that's important in a moment. Now, what happens following the Greeks is Alexander dies, his kingdom is divided into 4 parts, and there is a group who are placed over the rule of sort of that part of the Middle East. And then eventually you have the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We study him every year when we study the story of Hanukkah. He sought out to basically destroy Jewish life, and there were Jews who had no issue with it, by the way, especially those upper class we talked about earlier who were becoming very Hellenized, who were speaking Greek, who were looking like Greeks, who were talking like Greeks. And if the Bengals ever did a sequel to Walk Like an Egyptian, it would have been Walk Like a Hellen. So we talk about, and so there was this great revolt. The Greeks were kicked out for about 100 years, but then the Romans came in. And during this time, there were 4 primary groups, and I apologize, I know many of you know it, but I'm just going to talk about for a moment. You had the Sadducees, which were sort of in the Hebrew, the tzaddikim, but they were members of the aristocracy. They participated in the priesthood. They did not believe in immortality of the soul. They did not accept oral Torah. By the way, the early rabbis, date back to about 400 before the Common Era, give or take. That's where you start to see this small group of elite intellectuals doing interpretive exercises of the Torah. But they are not viewed as being authoritative over the entirety of the Jewish community yet. You had the Pharisees, which are, these proto-rabbis, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, the men of the Great Assembly, the ones doing this oral interpretive tradition. You have the Essenes, which we talk about with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The Essenes were a group of ascetics. They were semi-monastic between the 2nd and 1st century before the Common Era. We don't know much about them, except by the 1st century there were about 4,000 followers. They were adult males only, which explains why they didn't last long. They engaged in personal modesty and religious purity, and they went off to Qumran. They built this community in the desert. The Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, they probably did not write, but they took their library with them. So that was collections of writings that they took that thankfully were found, and you can now visit in the museum, the Dead Sea Scroll Museum in Jerusalem. And so there are a lot of proof texts in there for what becomes the Hebrew Bible. And then there's the 4th group, my favorite group, the Zealots. The Zealots rejected the Greeks, the Zealots rejected the Romans, they engaged in guerrilla warfare, and they're the ones who led the revolt against Rome in the year 66 in the Common Era. What happened? They lost. No more Zealots. They were the ones who, for the most part, died out through the revolt and died out in Masada. So you've got these 4 groups sort of competing for the hearts and minds of the Israelites. Secondly, you've got the Romans. Now the Romans really didn't care what you did as long as you paid your taxes and didn't cause trouble. What did the Israelites not want to do? They didn't want to pay their taxes, and they didn't like having the Romans rule over them, so they caused lots of trouble. So it is a time of great turmoil between the first century before the Common Era through the first century in the Common Era. The best cinematic depiction of this, believe it or not, is Monty Python's Life of Brian. I mention that because it shows in all of these different groups of Israelites fighting with the Romans and fighting with each other. So it's utter chaos. And amidst this, all of this, you start to have the rise of messiahs. Why? Because things are getting really awful, and you have these charismatic leaders with followers who are saying, follow me, I will show you the true path to redemption. Why don't we know about most of them? Because most of them were probably killed, and their writers, their followers never wrote anything about them. But there was one person from Nazareth who had a small group of followers, and his ministry lasted only about a year, by the way. And he caused trouble both in the temple and for Roman society. He was captured, tried by Roman authorities, executed by Roman authorities. Crucifixion is not a Jewish means of execution. How did Jews execute people? Stoning. Everybody must get stoned. And that would have been it, except he had the greatest PR person in all of history, Paul of Tarsus. Paul spread his ministry far and wide, planted the seeds that would ultimately become Christianity. But, and this is a very important thing, Jesus was born as a Jew, he lived as a Jew, he died as a Jew, and as far as most scholars can ascertain, he never believed he was the Son of God. Now, why is all this important? Well, this is important because he represents in subsequent writings, especially in the Gospels and the teachings of Paul, the combination, a different combination of resurrection of the dead and the Messiah. So why did, and by the way, his early followers were Jews. And he was, you might argue, a reformer. People say he was a rabbi. I don't think he was a rabbi, because rabbis were not interested in impacting the world. They were really focused on their intellectual studies and raising up groups of students. They weren't out there to rebel rouse at that moment in time. Bar Kokhba comes along and he's interested in rebel rousing, but that's a whole other story. So, as I mentioned, he was born, he's Jesus of Nazareth. He's not Jesus of Bethlehem, by the way. He's Jesus of Nazareth because he came from the Galilee region. And he had that group of followers, and we don't have much on the historical Jesus. Almost everything we have is on the theological Jesus. And that is because by the time people started writing down his story, it was at least 30 years after he died. So the Gospels are credited to his followers, but they didn't write the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John, by the way, is a whole other thing. You can talk about another time. But what they did is they knew their Hebrew Bible. And they knew what the Mashiach was supposed to be. And so they borrowed from the Hebrew Bible stories of Elijah and Elisha and David to sort of make Jesus fit the mold of what the Messiah was supposed to be. But there were problems. First of all, the Mashiach, the Redeemer of Israel by this point, because life is so awful, is they're supposed to show up and make it so everything's great again. For Israel, the Messiah is supposed to arrive at a time where we have like 1,000 years of peace, where every day feels like Shabbat. That did not happen. Secondly, the Messiah has to be from the line of David. Where was David born? Bethlehem. So, Jesus' followers went to Jews and said, the Messiah has come. Will you accept him? And Jews said no, because, one, he didn't fulfill messianic prophecies. The world did not get better for us, it got worse. Matter of fact, another 35 years after he died, Jerusalem was sacked and the temple was burned to the ground. And all the wealth of Israel was taken back to Rome. You can see it in Titus's Arch. What did they do with the wealth? Well, they used it to build up the Colosseum, which already existed. What was in the Colosseum? It was famous for chariot races. So for all of you NASCAR fans, you're welcome. Secondly, he did not embody the personal qualifications of the Messiah. How so? Well, he wasn't from the line of David. And the Messiah for us is fully human. Messiah is not divine. The Messiah is a human being. And the Mashiach, the notion of the Messiah in Jewish tradition, is the Redeemer of all of Israel. So what happened is they changed the narrative. This is why you get the story of being born in Bethlehem. But that's a later addition. That probably did not happen. It doesn't make any sense if you think about it logically. He was not the Son of God, at least according to our understanding, and he can't be the Messiah because everything got worse. So why do I mention all this? Because you may be very much familiar with a lot of this. Well, the reason why it's important is because the notion of Messiah is a Jewish concept. And for Christianity, they are deeply bothered. And I'm not talking for all Christians, by the way. I'm not speaking for the entirety of Christendom. But throughout history, they were deeply bothered that we would reject Jesus as Messiah, because we are the experts in the Messiah, which means deep down, maybe he isn't. So you have two options when dealing with the question of Jews rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. One is to say, okay, you're right. We're wrong. We're going to find another pathway forward. Or your rejection and your deicide, because we're the ones blamed for killing Jesus. Why are we blamed? Well, because after we rejected him as Messiah, they went out to the Roman world and said the Messiah has come, and much of the Roman world over time embraced him in early Christianity. Well, the Romans can't be the bad guys, but you need a bad guy in the story, so who becomes the bad guys? The Jews. So a lot, and this is a different topic for another time, a lot of anti-Semitism in the Christian world begins with rejection of Jesus as Messiah. And so what happens is, well, why are Jews still around if they rejected him and they engaged in deicide? Well, they're still around because they will recognize him when he comes back. One, this is important for later on with evangelicals. And two, because they rejected him, they have to suffer. So over time, you have anti-Jewish laws established in the Roman world, first because we revolted against them, then sort of concretized in the Holy Roman Empire, and they're persisting all the way up to modern times. Because Jews have to suffer, but we have to stay around because we're the experts in the Messiah. By the way, this is why they built the ghettos. Not talking the 20th century ones, but the ones in like Italy. They built them because many communities were like, yeah, let's just kill the Jews. And the Roman authority, the Catholic authorities were like, well, no, we need them around. So they'll be contained at night, they'll be safe, and then they can work throughout the day, but they're going to still be impoverished because they have to suffer. We want them to suffer, but we don't want them all dead. Gee, thanks. With friends like these, who needs an enemies?
Excuse my ignorance. Can you go back and just clarify why our view of the Messiah has to be in the line of David?
So the Messiah is, first of all, fully human, never divine. And by the way, they do create Joseph, Jesus' father, and connect him all the way back to David and all the way back to Abraham. But that's problematic because if God's the father, then Joseph isn't the father. He's the stepfather, so it doesn't matter what his lineage is. Don't quote me on that. So it's sort of the standard belief because the ones that they refer to as the anointed ones are from the Davidic line who appear at particular moments to help save Israel from their enemies. So that sort of becomes a concretized belief that whoever the Mashiach is, they'll be from the line of David. And by the way, this is why Elijah goes to every bris. Because any boy born into Judaism has a potential to be the Messiah. Yeah, that's why he comes to every bris. Now, that's not universal belief in Judaism. There's streams and strains who believe there is no individual Messiah, or as the book says, there is no Messiah and you're it. Meaning, we don't need to wait for a person to show up and redeem us. As a matter of fact, if you're waiting for a singular person, usually bad things happen. So this is where we get the idea that we have to engage in making the world better, so much so that we won't even need the Messiah. But that's sort of where it comes from. So great question. But again, it's all about national revelation, national restoration. So why is all of this important? Well, it's because if we are the experts in the Messiah, we need to stick around. This is part of the reason why they are obsessed with us. But there started to arise over time a belief that Jesus is only going to come back when X number of Jews convert to Christianity. There needs to be a remnant, but X number of Jews need to convert to Christianity. How many? We don't know. No clue. So this is why, and I don't have the proof text in front of me, but every Jewish soul is worth, for certain groups, about 100,000 Gentile souls. Really? Yes. This is why it's, yeah, you want to go out and convert the non-believers, but you get a Jew. That is worth something. And this one cracks me up. There have been attempts to convert rabbis because the belief that if you convert the rabbi, the congregation will convert. Oh my God. Which, if you know Jewish congregations, is hilarious. We can't even get everyone to stand up at the same time. So, I'm skipping ahead because we only have so much time. And I also want to make sure to leave a little time for questions, which is, we need Jews around and we need enough of them to convert for Jesus to return. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this. One is you evangelize to Jews, which is something we sometimes talk about with our high school students especially, to recognize what evangelizing looks like. Evangelizing, and we're not going to dive into all of that today, but it involves using proof texts from the Hebrew Bible, especially proof texts that talk about the Messiah. See, Isaiah was talking and predicting the arrival of Jesus. The problem is all prophets are talking to their time. They are not predicting the future 1,000 years from now, or 1,000 years from when they were speaking. They are talking to a contemporary audience. They are not prophesizing for hundreds of years later. They're not even thinking about it. They're talking to their audience. But it can, for some people who are not well schooled in the Hebrew Bible in evangelizing, it can seem authoritative. They like to use proof texts. And there are two groups that we often conflate with each other, but are actually two very different groups. Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews. So we're going to take a moment just to talk about them, because they are very different groups. Jews for Jesus was created by Moshe Rosen in San Francisco in 1973. The purpose of Jews for Jesus was to make it easy for Jews to become Christian. So they are a group that does not authentically represent who they really are. Their goal is aggressive evangelism. They like media attention, and they're really only focused on proselytizing. Not to be confused with Messianic Jews. And by the way, neither group are Jewish. So, and this is a point I've argued both publicly and on social media and everywhere else. Once you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, you are by definition Christian. I don't care if you wear a tallis, you are a Christian. I don't care if you do a Passover Seder, you are a Christian. Now, Messianic Jews, which started in the 1920s, incorporated and became very popular in the 60s, incorporated a lot of Jewish rituals and traditions and viewed themselves as being what they call completed Jews by accepting Jesus into their lives. So both groups, and by the way, Messianic Jews despise Jews for Jesus. Now, for our purposes, we can use the term synonymously because they're both problematic, but I think it helps us to understand what each group represents. But nonetheless, both are representative of an idea that you need to get Jews to embrace Christianity for Jesus' return. And what's the next thing you need? You need Jews to return to Israel. You need Jews to return to the Holy Land, to Israel. So the idea of millennialism really became popular, you can say a little bit at the turn of the 20th century, but really in 1948. For a lot of Christian communities, the rise of the state of Israel was the beginning of the promise of the return of Jesus. So Christian Zionists, and not all Christian Zionists, by the way, I'm speaking with a broad brush, it's not that they care about Jews or the state of Israel, but they care about what Israel represents for their theological understanding of the return of Jesus. Now, I mentioned that. A little bit of more background about myself. I married into an Israeli family. My in-laws are so Israeli, they actually predate the state of Israel. My wife, born in the United States in New York, so New Israel. Her first language is Hebrew. She has an Israeli passport. So I very much am married into an Israeli family, and wonderful family. The irony is, so she's an only child, and when she told them she was dating a rabbinic student, what did my in-laws envision? But the black hat, the long beard, the payas, and a life of poverty. They're like, we did not raise our only child to live this way. And I've finally been accepted 25 years later. So, but I remember I was at her uncle's house for a dinner party with a bunch of Israelis there, because Israelis find each other and they love to, celebrate together. And we were discussing Christian Zionism. And I said, aren't you bothered that they actually don't want to see a successful Jewish state? They want to see all the Jews return to Israel, and we'll get to this in a moment, see Israel destroyed and then the return of Jesus. And they said, you know what, that's down the road. We don't have many friends, so we're going to take what we can get. And I thought that was very interesting, because some of the biggest supporters of Israel, though there are actually sort of breaks in it right now, are Christian Zionists. So where does all of this come from? Well, there was an early Christian concept that there would be 999 years of peace. Where do we find it in Scripture? We don't. It just sort of arose. But what happened is that by the year 1000, Jesus was going to come and Jews will accept him and we'll have 1,000 years of peace. Well, there was no peace. So what do you do in place? Well, you build the church. So one of my professors said it was God's audible. So the church came into being until Jesus returns. So for the first 1,000 years, it would last 1,000 years, Jesus would come back. He didn't. Okay, so what do? Well, we'll renew another 1,000 years, which gets us up to the year 2000. Well, he still hasn't come back, so what's going to happen?
Another 1,000 years.
Well, that's one possibility, but our world today, we tend to be very self-centered. And what I mean by that is it's all about me, and in my moment in life is when everything is going to happen. And so for some people, there arose this notion of the millennialists and the tribulation. It started with a man by the name of John Nelson Darby, who was born around the year 1800, lived to 1882. He was born in London, educated in Ireland, and became a priest in the Anglican Church. And he became convinced that the church was ruined. And so he began to promote a new movement called the Tribulation, which didn't really catch on in England, but it really caught on here in the United States. And so this notion of the tribulation is that there's going to be, and I'm oversimplifying, but just giving you a little bit of a sense of it, that there's going to be a 7-year period of catastrophe. There will be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's primarily based off the book of Daniel. Any of you guys read the book of Daniel or looked at the book of Daniel? Book of Daniel is bizarre. It is written in Hebrew, and it's got Greek, and it's got Aramaic. The reason why it's bizarre, by the way, is it was probably written during the Hasmonean revolt, during the time of Judah the Maccabee fighting against the Greeks. Well, you didn't want to write exactly what was happening because the author could be found and killed by the Greek authorities. So instead, it's a book written in code. And anything written in code is unintelligible, but you can interpret it in a wide variety of ways. And so it contains a broad variety of images that can be really weirdly interpreted. So we are going to skip way far ahead. Page 18 in your packet looks a little like this. And by the way, these are yours. You can read through them. I provide a bibliography at the end of the packet that is for your own references. And so you see amongst it the 4 kingdoms between Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then ultimately Rome, which become divided into 4 notions, which we see on the next page, where they sort of talk about the Antichrist. So what does all of this mean? Well, first, for many of these millennialists, there will be the rapture. Have you guys heard of the rapture? That's where all good Christians will ascend to heaven, and all their stuff will remain behind, including their clothes, by the way. I've seen some of those Christians. I'm not sure how that's a reward. And so as I sometimes tease some of my friends, it's like, if the rapture's coming, can I have your stuff? So the best people are going to ascend to heaven. For everybody else, and this is, by the way, the basis for the Left Behind series, there's going to be a war. There's going to arise a figure who's going to be charismatic, have a number of followers. Please don't read anything politically into what I'm saying. Who's going to lead, who's going to seem to provide humanity with promises of redemption, but basically lead them into this war. And he's going to be identified by the number 666. The number, so it's the 666 is not the number for the devil, it's for the Antichrist. And there's going to be this great work. He's doing the work of the devil, but he's not the devil. And then, about 3.5 years into his reign, there will be this, Jesus is going to show up with the armies from heaven, and there's going to be this great battle. Now what happens? Jews will have all returned to Israel. 1/3 of us will convert. 1/3 of us will remain Jewish, and 1/3 will die. But during that time, we are going to destroy the Temple Mount with the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuild the temple. This is, by the way, why there are groups of evangelicals who support the effort to build the third temple. Of course, as we know, if anything there is destroyed, that's going to lead to tremendous war. And no, bad, not a good thing. The temple will be restored. Now you're going to have this great battle, and during it, the temple is going to be destroyed, but the temple of the kingdom of heaven, the fourth temple, will be established, and the reign of Jesus will return upon the land. So I mention all of this, and part of it is based off interpretations of our various texts like Ezekiel, who has some very interesting writings, in the book of Daniel, who has some interesting writings. And you read about like the land of Gog and Magog and Meshech and Tubal and Persia and Cush and Put Gomer and Bet Togarma. And people just read anything into those texts that they want. But at the end of the day, Israel and Jews are essential to this story of messianism, of millennialism, of the tribulation. So these, and again, this is just a brief overview. It's much more complicated, much more nuanced, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of why, as I started with, they are so obsessed with us. Because we represent the ability for them to help bring Jesus back. Which is problematic because we just want to be left alone. Right? And we've been saying that for 2,000 years. Just leave us alone. But they're obsessed with us. But the other reason why they're obsessed with us is Christianity comes from Judaism. And our rejection of Christianity has always deep down bothered them. To somewhat similar degree, our rejection of Islam, which also comes from Judaism. We are the founding tradition. And so when you are rejected, you can say, to heck with it, I want nothing to do with you, or you can constantly engage, but in ways that have never been beneficial for the Jewish people. So this 1800s notion of the rise of the tribulation is not really good for us. And it's not that I want to disavow any Christian Zionist support of Israel. It's just important for us to understand where it's coming from. Now, caveat to that is there are plenty of friends of Israel who do not buy into the theological notion. And there are plenty of enemies of Israel who don't buy into the theological notion. So don't paint everyone with that brush. But I just wanted to provide it as a resource for you to understand part of the larger conversation, especially when you hear someone like Pastor Hagee. This is something, he's completely all in on this. And founded an organization, Kufi, Christians United for Israel. That's sort of where it's coming from. Which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be in relationship with them, but you should have an understanding of where they're coming from. So questions? Yes?
Again, sorry.
No, don't apologize.
So if this business about the rapture just started around 1800, which current groups of Christians have embraced that?
So you could argue there are different streams of modern evangelicals, that it's part of their theology. I used to know more about the different streams of Christianity than I do today because I haven't really studied it in a long time. I don't think it's really popularized in Mormonism or Catholicism or in sort of the modern liberal like Methodist or Presbyterian, but the more evangelical streams, that's where you're going to find some of these beliefs espoused. And by the way, as a complete random aside, so I got as happens almost every year, hey, Rabbi, my church is doing a Seder. Can you come lead it? Well, first of all, Jesus has had a Last Supper. How do we know that? Because everybody has a Last Supper, as one of my professors said. His Last Supper was not a Seder. Why do we know that? Because Seders didn't exist yet during his time. During Passover, and we don't know if he died during Passover, what did you do? You went to Jerusalem and you made your Pesach offering if you're an able-bodied male. That's what you did. You didn't sit down and have this multi-course meal designed after a Roman festive meal, because that's what the rabbis created after the destruction of the temple. So I'm like, one, it's an anachronism, and it's not appropriate for historical purposes. And secondly, it would be, it's also not appropriate because it's a Jewish rite. So I will, as I say, I'm happy to come teach about the Seder, about Passover, but I'm not going to come run a Seder for you. That's Jewish. You're welcome to come to one, but it's not appropriate to do it out of a Jewish context. Yeah.
Could I have about 60 seconds, maybe 120 seconds, about yesterday's press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump? And what's the Reform take on this?
So I can't speak with authority because I haven't seen the press conference. Believe it or not, I've been working really hard to limit my exposure to the news for my own sanity. And by the way, if you are a proud supporter of Donald Trump, President Trump, and you're a devout Republican and that's your world, Mazel Tov, I'm happy for you. This is not a political statement. What I do know is that it's interesting that there were people who chose to vote for Trump because they believed he was going to end the conflict in Gaza. And the reality is because he is a lot of his support comes from Christian evangelicals, he is very much in that camp. He could care less about what happens to Muslims. I mean, we've seen it during his previous presidency. He believes in the Jewish state, not because he's friends with Bibi. He believes in the Jewish state because of a lot of what we've talked about, because his supporters believe that that represents their theological future. But I don't think he has any real understanding of that theology because he's not interested in religion. He's interested in himself. So I take everything the two of them say together seriously, and I know the two of them united, generally speaking, is probably not in the best interest of a lot of people. So what's the Reform response? They're working on it. What's a conservative response? They're working on it. What's the Orthodox response? They're working on it. Look, and this is a conversation that I think is very important to have about American-Israel relationship, which is very significant and complicated and intertwined and important. But I can't do it justice al regel achat, so I'm not going to try to, but I just wanted to emphasize, thank you for raising the question. That's big part of the reason, because I would argue he really doesn't care about the Middle East. He's much more an isolationist, but it serves his purposes, and he's always willing to take advantage of things that serve his purpose.
I think regarding your question, I think regarding the Panama Canal and Canada and Greenland and now Gaza, I think he's using this as a negotiating point so that he'll get something less than he wants.
Right. And it was all about setting up hotels in Gaza.
Right.
And by the way, Gaza is, destruction aside, the location is gorgeous. But that's conversation for another time. Yes?
I enjoyed your presentation very, very much. But we go and give a little bit of, I don't know what to call it, humor in that. Is that Hagee that you mentioned from San Antonio was invited to speak at APAC
Yep.
a number of years ago, and I was there. And I must say, I thought that he comes out, this big man, physically big, and he says to basically a Jewish audience in that sort of style that you hear on Sunday morning. He said, now there was Abraham, and there was Isaac, and there was Hezekiah, and there was, well, on and on, he said, and not a Baptist among the bunch. Well, yeah, anybody could do that, you know. It was something
So I've been to a number of APAC conferences, a blessed memory, and heard the gamut too, because the reason why APAC is successful, or at least is because, not because of Jews, but because of our Christian partners. Because we represent less than 2% of the population of the United States. And by the way, if we control the world's wealth, first of all, where's my cut?
Yeah.
And secondly, we like to claim that we have more power than we actually do, but they would get a lot of powerful, charismatic people there. I remember, so there was one presentation before they sent us off to go speak to our elected officials, and it was a Baptist minister who got everybody up shouting, hallelujah, and you felt the electricity in the room. And one of my members turned to me and said, how come we don't have services like that? And I said, that's because we are the Presbyterians of the Jewish world. So,
I'm not defending APAC.
no, I'm neither defending. For a long time, I really appreciated their mission. I'm not as involved with them now because it's become fundamentally a political support organization, but when it was truly bipartisan, I liked going because you could really hear from a huge breadth of people about their perspectives about what it means to be in relationship with Israel. And so that part, so we're going to get to one last question and then we'll wrap up.
Rabbi, thanks for being here. I'm just curious with the Messianic and Jews for Jesus and all that, ethnically speaking, if you're from a long line of Jewish ancestors, etc., could you be ethnically Jewish and practice Christianity? Or, where does that live?
So the challenge is, great question. So the challenge is Judaism is neither a race nor a religion, but we have elements of both. We are what I like to call, I don't even like to call us people, I call us a family. And so there are fences to that family, which is why you can be Jewish and be an atheist. But once you embrace a different religious tradition, you are saying, I am joining a different family. So yeah, you can come from a long line of Jews, but once you're Christian, and that's okay. I have no issue with people making that decision. I just don't love it when they misrepresent themselves. So yeah, you could do all the trappings of Judaism and love all the cultural pieces of Judaism. Go to Bagel Bin and have lox on your bagel. But if you're going to church and doing the Eucharist, you're still Christian. You have good taste in food.
But Rabbi Schneerson, who was ultra-Orthodox, he said if you're born a Jew, you die as a Jew, despite what you do in between.
Right, but in between, you're not a Jew.
Right, but you die as a Jew.
You die as a Jew. Yes, so you can be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Drive safe.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
very
you so
welcome.
much, Rabbi Sharff.